When shy cleaning girl Eliza entered what she thought was an empty miner's cabin in 1867 Montana Territory, she expected to find the usual mess of bottles and unwashed clothes. Instead, she discovered a framed photograph on the mantelpiece, a picture of herself as a child, standing next to a boy she couldn't remember, in a place she'd never been. But if she had no memory of this photograph being taken, then who was the mysterious boy beside her? And why did his amber eyes look exactly like her own? A gunshot cracked through the mountain air, sending Eliza Hartwell diving behind a wooden water barrel outside Murphy's General Store. Her heart hammered like a blacksmith's anvil as she pressed her face against the rough wood, waiting for the danger to pass. But when she peeked around the edge, she saw only old Pete practicing his aim at tin cans behind the saloon, his laughter echoing off the buildings. Welcome to Cedar Falls, Montana Territory, in the autumn of 1867, where even the smallest sounds could make a person jump clean out of their skin. Eliza brushed the dust from her faded blue dress and picked up her cleaning basket, trying to ignore the stares from the miners lounging on the store's front porch. 3 weeks had passed since she'd stepped off the supply wagon, and she still felt like a fish trying to swim in honey. Every face was a stranger's face. Every voice carried the rough edges of men who'd spent their lives digging gold from stubborn ground. The boarding house where she worked sat at the end of Main Street, like a tired old woman in a rocking chair. Mrs. Caldwell, the owner, had taken Eliza in after hearing her sad story about fleeing Missouri. The woman had kind eyes, but a voice that could cut through steel when she needed to get things done. "Morning, child," Mrs. Caldwell called from the kitchen window as Eliza approached. Steam from boiling laundry poured out around the older woman's gray head. "Got a special job for you today." Eliza climbed the back steps, her boots making soft thuds on the worn wood. The smell of soap and bacon grease mixed together in a way that should have been awful, but somehow felt like home. She'd learned to find comfort in small things since leaving her uncle's farm. "Yes, ma'am?" Eliza set her basket on the kitchen table next to a pile of folded linens. Mrs. Caldwell wiped her hands on her apron and pulled a brass key from her pocket. The metal caught the morning light coming through the window. "Cabin 7 needs cleaning. Miner named Henderson moved out yesterday morning. Left it in decent shape, but you know how men live." Eliza had cleaned enough cabins to know exactly how men lived. Coffee grounds on every surface, clothes that hadn't seen soap in months, and usually a bottle or two hidden under the bed. She took the key, feeling its weight in her palm. "Anything special about this one?" she asked. Mrs. Caldwell's expression shifted, like clouds passing over the sun. Henderson was different from most. Quiet fellow, kept to himself. Always paid his rent on time and never caused trouble. She paused, studying Eliza's face. "Reminded me a bit of you, actually. Same way of moving through the world without making much noise." Something in the woman's tone made Eliza's stomach flutter, but she couldn't figure out why. She nodded and headed for the door, slinging her cleaning supplies over her shoulder. The morning air carried the scent of pine needles and wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a hammer rang against metal as the blacksmith started his daily work. Cedar Falls was waking up the way mining towns always did. Slowly, with lots of grumbling and the clink of coffee cups. Cabin 7 sat apart from the others, tucked between 2 tall pine trees that swayed in the mountain breeze. Most of the cabins stood in neat rows like soldiers, but this one seemed to have found its own special spot. Eliza had walked past it dozens of times, but never really looked at it closely. As she got nearer, she noticed things that seemed odd. The windows were cleaner than most. A small pile of split firewood sat stacked neatly beside the door, instead of scattered around like usual. Even the steps looked like someone had swept them recently. She fitted the key into the lock, surprised when it turned easily. Most of the cabin doors stuck and needed a good shove, but this one opened smooth as butter. Eliza stepped inside and immediately stopped moving. This wasn't what she'd expected at all. Sunlight streamed through spotless windows, lighting up a room that looked more like someone's home than a temporary place to sleep. A small wooden table sat in the exact center, with two chairs that matched perfectly. Someone had carved flowers into the chair backs, tiny roses and leaves that must have taken hours to complete. Books lined a shelf made from pine boards and rocks. Real books, not the usual collection of torn newspapers and old catalogs she found in most cabins. Their leather covers looked well-loved, like someone had read them over and over. A quilt covered the narrow bed, its pattern of blue and white squares, reminding Eliza of something she couldn't quite remember. Everything in the cabin had its proper place, as if the person who lived here cared about making beauty in the middle of nowhere. But strangest of all was the silence. Not the empty silence of an abandoned place, but the peaceful quiet of somewhere that had been loved. Eliza found herself holding her breath, afraid to disturb whatever magic lived in these walls. She set down her basket and pulled out a cleaning cloth, moving more carefully than usual. This place deserved gentle treatment. As she began dusting the windowsill, she started humming under her breath, something she never did around other people. The sound of her own voice surprised her. When had she stopped singing? Back in Missouri, she used to hum while feeding chickens and hanging laundry. Her uncle always said she had a voice like a meadowlark. But somewhere along the way, she'd learned to keep her music locked inside. Now, in this peaceful cabin, the melody seemed to float out of her without permission. The notes mixed with dust, motes dancing in the golden light, creating something magical. She worked her way around the room, amazed by how little actual cleaning was needed. The previous tenant had left everything spotless. Her cloth picked up only the thinnest layer of dust, as if he'd just stepped out for a walk and planned to return any minute. When she reached the fireplace, Eliza paused to admire the careful way someone had arranged the cold ashes. Even his fire building had been neat and thoughtful. Above the mantel, a small shelf held a few personal items: a pocket watch, a leather journal, and something that made her heart skip: a photograph in a gold frame, facing toward the wall. Curiosity killed the cat, but satisfaction brought it back. That's what Eliza's grandmother used to say. As she stared at the back of that gold frame, every sensible part of her mind screamed to leave it alone. Personal belongings weren't her business. Good cleaning girls minded their own affairs and kept their hands to themselves. But something about that photograph called to her, like a voice from a half-remembered dream. She reached toward it, then pulled her hand back, reached again, hesitated, then finally grasped the frame with trembling fingers. The metal felt warm, as if it had been sitting in sunlight for hours instead of shadow. Slowly, carefully, she turned it around. The world stopped spinning. Staring back at her from behind the glass was her own face. Unmistakably, impossibly her own face. But younger, maybe 12 years old, with hair in neat braids instead of the simple bun she wore now. The little girl in the photograph smiled with pure joy, the kind of happiness Eliza barely remembered feeling. But that wasn't the strangest part. Next to the little girl stood a boy of perhaps 14, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. His hair caught the light the same way hers did. His eyes held the same unusual golden brown color that people always commented on when they met her. And his smile looked exactly like her own, right down to the tiny gap between his front teeth. Eliza's legs gave out. She sank into the nearest chair, clutching the photograph against her chest, while her mind spun like a dust devil. This couldn't be real. She'd never posed for such a picture. She had no memory of this boy, no memory of wearing that particular white dress with tiny blue flowers. Yet the evidence sat right there in her hands, solid as stone. Her breathing came in short gasps as she stared at the impossible image. The boy's face seemed familiar in a way that made her heart ache, like trying to remember a song she'd heard in childhood. Something about his expression, the protective way he held his shoulders, whispered of shared secrets and promises she couldn't quite grasp. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin windows and stirring the pine branches into a restless dance. The sound seemed to match the chaos in her mind, a wild rushing that made it hard to think clearly. She noticed other details in the photograph now. Behind the children stood a house she'd never seen, with a wide front porch and climbing roses. A dog sat at their feet, a spotted mutt with one ear that flopped over. In the background she could make out part of a river and what looked like a mill wheel. None of it rang even the faintest bell in her memory. Eliza had grown up on her uncle's farm in Missouri after her parents died in a fever epidemic. She remembered that much clearly. The long, lonely years of feeling like an unwanted burden, the cold meals eaten in silence, the constant reminder that she should be grateful for charity. There had been no brothers, no sisters, no family photographs on the mantel. So who was this boy who looked so much like her? And why did his presence in the picture feel like coming home? She studied his face more closely, tracing the line of his jaw with her finger through the glass. Something about his eyes suggested kindness, mixed with determination. This was someone who would keep his word, who would fight for the people he loved. The way he stood next to the little girl, next to her, spoke of fierce protection and genuine affection. A brother. The word appeared in her mind without warning, bringing with it a flood of emotions she couldn't name. She'd always felt like something was missing from her life, some essential piece that would make everything else make sense. Looking at this photograph, that empty space inside her chest seemed to throb with recognition. But how could she have a brother she didn't remember? How could such an important person simply vanish from her memory? The photograph trembled in her hands as tears began sliding down her cheeks. These weren't the bitter tears she'd cried so often lately. Tears of loneliness and rejection, and feeling invisible to the world. These were different, deeper. They tasted like grief for something lost, and hope for something that might still be found. A sound outside made her freeze. Footsteps on the cabin steps, moving with purpose. Someone was coming. Panic shot through her like lightning. She wasn't supposed to be here looking through personal belongings. Mrs. Caldwell trusted her to do her job and mind her own business. What would happen if someone caught her crying over a stranger's photograph? But as the footsteps reached the porch, something even more terrifying occurred to her. What if this wasn't a stranger's photograph at all? What if the person coming through that door knew exactly who she was and why her picture sat on his mantel? The doorknob turned with a soft click. Eliza shot to her feet, hastily wiping her cheeks while trying to hide the photograph behind her back. Her cleaning supplies lay scattered where she'd dropped them, making it obvious she hadn't been doing her job. Heat flooded her face as she prepared to stammer out an apology. The door swung open, and a tall figure stepped into the cabin, silhouetted against the bright morning light. For a moment, neither of them moved, as if the entire world had paused to see what would happen next. Then the man removed his hat, and Eliza's heart stopped beating. Auburn hair caught the firelight streaming through the windows. Golden brown eyes, the exact same shade as her own, stared at her with growing amazement. The face from the photograph, aged by perhaps 10 years but unmistakably the same, looked at her as if seeing a ghost. "Eliza?" His voice came out rough with emotion and disbelief. "Little Lizzie, who used to catch lightning bugs in mason jars and sing lullabies to her rag doll?" The photograph slipped from her nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor as her world tilted completely sideways. Nobody had called her Lizzie since she was very small. Nobody knew about the lightning bugs or the rag doll named Patches or the songs she used to sing when she thought no one was listening. But this man, this impossible, wonderful, terrifying man, knew all of it. "You're not real." Eliza pressed herself against the cabin wall, her voice barely a whisper. "People don't just appear from photographs. This has to be some kind of fever dream." The man took a careful step forward, his hands raised like he was approaching a spooked horse. "I'm real as the mountains outside, Lizzie. And so are you, thank the Lord above." His eyes never left her face, drinking in every detail as if he was trying to memorize her all over again. "Though you're not the gap-toothed little sprite I remember chasing through cornfields." Something about the way he said cornfields sent a shiver down her spine. Not the cold mountain air kind of shiver, but the kind that came when your soul recognized something your mind had forgotten. She found herself studying his face with desperate intensity, searching for proof that this wasn't some cruel joke. "I don't remember any cornfields," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she caught a flash of something. Golden stalks, taller than her head, the sound of laughter, strong hands, lifting her up to see over the green waves of grain. He knelt down and picked up the fallen photograph, handling it like it was made of butterfly wings. "Course you don't. You were just 7 when they took you away. 7-year-olds don't hold on to memories the way older folks do." His voice carried pain so deep it made her chest ache. "I've been searching for you for 10 years, little sister. 10 long, lonely years." Sister. The word hit her like a lightning bolt, illuminating corners of her mind she'd kept locked away. Suddenly she could smell fresh-baked bread and hear a woman's voice singing hymns while hanging laundry. She could feel calloused hands braiding her hair and see a boy teaching her to skip stones across a lazy river. Daniel? The name escaped her lips without permission, floating between them like a bridge across time. His smile could have lit up the entire territory. "You do remember." But even as warmth flooded through her, doubt crept in like cold fog. "How do I know you're really him? How do I know you're not just some drifter who heard stories and decided to play a terrible trick?" Daniel reached into his vest pocket and pulled out something small and silver. When he opened his palm, Eliza saw a locket shaped like a heart, tarnished with age but still beautiful. "You gave me this the day they put you on the train. Said it was so I'd never forget your face." He pressed the tiny catch, and the locket sprang open. Inside was a miniature painting of a little girl with golden brown eyes and a gap-toothed grin. The same face from the photograph, but even younger. At the bottom, in careful child's writing, were the words, "For Danny, love, Lizzie." Eliza's knees buckled. She would have fallen if Daniel hadn't caught her, his strong arms wrapping around her the same way they had in the photograph. The scent of pine soap and honest work surrounded her, familiar as her own heartbeat. "I painted that myself," she whispered against his shoulder. "With Mama's watercolors. The ones in the little tin box with the dancing ladies on the lid." "You gave it to me at the train station in Springfield," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "Right before they loaded you into that cattle car with 20 other orphans. You were crying so hard you could barely breathe, but you still wanted to make sure I had something to remember you by." The memories came flooding back then. 10 years of buried pain and love rising to the surface like spring water. She remembered the fever that took their parents within days of each other. The neighbors whispering about what to do with the Morrison children. The awful day when the orphan train officials decided Daniel was old enough to work but Eliza needed a proper family. "You promised you'd find me," she said, pulling back to look into his eyes. "You stood on that platform and promised you'd come for me no matter how long it took. And here I am." His smile was gentle but determined. "Kept my word, didn't I?" But even in the joy of reunion, questions swirled in Eliza's mind. "How did you end up in Cedar Falls? How did you know I was here?" Daniel's expression grew more serious. Been following rumors and whispers for years. Every town, every territory, where someone mentioned a girl with golden eyes and a quiet way of moving through the world. Heard about you from a supply wagon driver who'd seen you arrive. Described you down to the freckles on your nose. He guided her to sit at the small table, taking the chair across from her like they were settling in for a long conversation. "I've been working the mines here for 3 months, hoping you'd turn up." When Mrs. Caldwell mentioned a new girl who reminded her of a lost bird, "I knew it had to be you. But this cabin," Eliza gestured around the neat, carefully arranged space. "It doesn't look like any miner's place I've ever seen." Daniel's cheeks reddened slightly. "Been saving up to make a real home. Figured when I found you, you'd need somewhere proper to live. Somewhere that felt safe and loved." He paused, studying her face. "That is, if you want to stay. If you want to be family again." The question hung between them like morning mist, beautiful and fragile. Eliza looked around the cabin with new eyes, seeing not just the neat arrangement of furniture, but the hope built into every corner, the matched chairs carved with patient hands, the quilt sewn with love and dreams of reunion, the photograph placed where he could see it every morning and every night. "You really never stopped looking," she said, wonder creeping into her voice. "Never even slowed down," Daniel confirmed. "Though there were times I wondered if you'd want to be found. You might have a whole new life now, new people you care about. Might not have room for a brother who let you get taken away. Tell me everything." Eliza leaned forward across the small table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee Daniel had brewed over the fire. "I want to know what happened to you after the train left. I want to know how you survived. I want to know why you became a miner instead of, I don't know, what did you dream of being when we were children?" Daniel's laugh was soft, but carried years of hard-won wisdom. Funny how dreams change when staying alive becomes the only goal that matters. He settled back in his chair, his eyes growing distant. "Remember how I used to say I'd be a riverboat captain? Sail all the way down to New Orleans and back, carrying cargo and seeing the world?" Eliza nodded, another memory surfacing like a cork bobbing to the surface of a pond. "You built that little boat out of tree bark and sailed it in Miller's Creek. It sank after about 2 minutes. Terrible boat builder, turns out." Daniel's smile faded as he continued. "After you left, I lived on the streets of Springfield for nearly a year. Slept in alleys, ate whatever scraps I could find or steal, got good at running fast and staying invisible." The coffee turned bitter in Eliza's mouth as she imagined her brother, barely 15 years old, fending for himself in a world that had no patience for orphaned children. "How did you not starve?" "Sometimes I nearly did, but I got lucky eventually. Man named Robert Chen found me trying to steal apples from his cart. Instead of calling the sheriff, he put me to work, taught me to read better, do sums, handle money." Daniel's expression softened with gratitude. "Mr. Chen was the first person who treated me like I had value, instead of like I was just another problem to solve." "What kind of work?" "Started with sweeping his shop and loading wagons. But Mr. Chen dealt in information as much as goods. Travelers would tell him news from other towns, other territories. Who was looking for work, where new settlements were starting up, which routes were safe for families." Daniel leaned forward, his eyes intense. "That's how I learned to track people down. How I learned that finding someone takes patience and the right kind of questions." Eliza felt a surge of admiration for this man who'd been just a boy when she last saw him. "He sounds like a good person." "The best. Worked for him until I was 18, learning everything he could teach me. When I finally told him about my lost sister, he didn't laugh or say I was chasing ghosts. He helped me plan the search." Daniel's voice grew rough with emotion. "Mr. Chen died 2 years ago, left me enough money to keep looking for you, without having to worry about starving. I wish I could thank him." "You can, by letting me take care of you the way he took care of me." Daniel reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "We're all the family each other has left in this world, Lizzie. That means something." But even as warmth spread through her at his words, doubt gnawed at the edges of her happiness. "What if I disappoint you? What if I'm not the sister you remember? 10 years is a long time to build someone up in your memory." Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "You think I've been searching for a 7-year-old girl all this time? I know you've grown up, Lizzie. I know life has changed you, probably hurt you in ways I can't even imagine. But you're still you, still the girl who painted me a locket and promised to remember my face." "I did forget, though," she whispered, shame coloring her cheeks. "For years, I forgot everything about our life before. I convinced myself I was just Eliza Hartwell, the unwanted niece who should be grateful for whatever scraps of kindness came her way." "That's not forgetting," Daniel said firmly. "That's surviving. Sometimes our minds hide painful memories to protect us from falling apart completely." He gestured toward the photograph, still sitting on the table between them. "But the important things, the love things, those never really disappear. They just wait for the right moment to come back." A comfortable silence settled between them as they sipped their coffee and studied each other's faces, mapping the changes time had wrought. Eliza found herself cataloging details, the way Daniel's hands moved when he talked, still quick and expressive, like when he was young. The patient way he waited for her to speak, giving her space to process everything. The careful way he'd arranged his cabin, as if creating a home for someone who might never come. "I have to ask you something," she said finally, "and I need you to tell me the truth, even if it's not what I want to hear." Daniel nodded, his expression serious. "Anything. Are you in some kind of trouble? The way you live here, so neat and careful, like you're ready to leave at a moment's notice, and the way you looked when you first walked in, like you were expecting someone else entirely." She paused, studying his face. "What aren't you telling me?" For the first time since the reunion began, Daniel's composure cracked slightly. He set down his coffee cup and rubbed his jaw, the gesture so familiar it made her heart clench. "Always were too smart for your own good," he said with a rueful smile. "Daniel, there might be some men looking for me," he admitted. "Nothing terrible, just a disagreement about a mining claim that got out of hand. But I don't want you worrying about—" His words were cut off by the thunder of approaching horses, moving fast and hard toward the cabin. Daniel's head snapped up, his body going taut as a bowstring. Through the window, Eliza could see dust clouds rising in the distance. "How many men?" she asked, surprised by how calm her own voice sounded. "3, maybe 4. Daniel was already moving, checking the loads in a rifle she hadn't noticed, leaning against the wall. "Lizzie, I need you to get down low and stay quiet. No matter what happens, don't try to be a hero." But as the hoofbeats grew louder and angry voices began shouting demands, Eliza felt something she'd never experienced before. A fierce, protective anger that burned away her fear like fire burning through dry grass. These men were threatening her brother, the only family she had left in the world, and she'd be damned if she'd let anyone take him away from her again. The first bullet splintered the window frame inches from Daniel's head, sending glass fragments dancing through the morning light like deadly snowflakes. Eliza hit the floor without thinking, her body moving faster than her fear could catch up. "Morrison!" a voice bellowed from outside, rough as gravel and twice as mean. "We know you're in there, you thieving snake. Time to pay what you owe." Daniel crouched below the window, rifle steady in his hands. His face had transformed from the gentle brother she'd been rediscovering into something harder, more dangerous. "Listen carefully, Lizzie," he whispered, without taking his eyes off the door. "There's a loose board behind the stove. Pull it up and crawl underneath the cabin. Stay there, no matter what you hear." "I'm not leaving you," she hissed back, surprised by the steel in her own voice. Another shot rang out, this one punching through the wooden wall and embedding itself in the opposite side with a dull thunk. Smoke began curling up from somewhere on the roof. They'd thrown a burning torch up there. "3 of them," Daniel muttered, peering through a gap in the shutters. "Baxter's gang. Should have known they'd track me here eventually." "What do they want?" Eliza asked, though she was already crawling toward the back of the cabin, her cleaning dress catching on the rough floorboards. "Mining claim up in Bear Creek Canyon. Found a vein of silver that could make a man rich, but Baxter thinks he has more right to it than I do." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Problem is, he might be correct about the legal part. His claim papers are older than mine." A third shot shattered what remained of the front window. This time, Eliza could see the muzzle flash from behind a fallen log about 50 yards away. The men had positioned themselves well. Good cover, clear sight lines, and patience enough to wait for their targets to make mistakes. "So why not just give them the claim?" she asked. Though even as the words left her mouth, she understood why that wasn't possible. Her brother wasn't the type to back down from a fight, especially not when he was in the right. "Because I found that silver fair and square, and I've been working it honest for 6 months." Daniel shifted position, trying to get a better angle on their attackers. "That silver is my ticket to building a real life. Maybe buying some land, starting a business, making a home for my family." The word family hit Eliza like a physical blow. He meant her. All of this, the danger, the violence, the risk, was connected to his dream of creating a place where they could be together. She felt a mixture of love and guilt so strong it nearly choked her. "Morrison," the voice outside shouted again. "Send out the girl and we'll make this quick. No need for innocent folks to get hurt." Eliza's blood ran cold. They knew she was here. Somehow, they'd been watching long enough to see her enter the cabin. Daniel's face went white as mountain snow. "How long have they been tracking you?" she whispered. "Too long, apparently." Daniel's hands shook slightly as he checked his ammunition. "I thought I'd been careful, but—" The cabin door exploded inward with a crash that seemed to shake the entire mountain. The first man through was built like a bear, with arms thick as tree trunks and a beard that hadn't seen scissors in years. Behind him came two more, both carrying rifles and wearing the kind of expressions that suggested they enjoyed their work entirely too much. "Well, well," the bear man said, his voice carrying mock surprise. "Daniel Morrison and his pretty little sister. Ain't this cozy?" Daniel's rifle swung toward the intruders, but he hesitated for just a moment, probably calculating whether he could hit all three before they could hurt Eliza. That moment of hesitation cost him everything. The second man moved with surprising speed for someone his size, tackling Daniel around the waist and sending them both crashing into the carefully arranged furniture. The rifle went flying, landing somewhere behind the overturned table. "Get the girl!" Bearman shouted. "Don't let her run!" But Eliza wasn't planning to run. Something inside her had snapped the moment these men burst into Daniel's peaceful cabin. Their cabin, the sanctuary he'd built while dreaming of family reunions. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace and swung it at the nearest attacker with every ounce of strength in her body. The poker connected with his shoulder, sending him stumbling backward with a roar of pain and surprise. "Little wildcat's got claws," he yelled, but there was respect mixed with the anger in his voice. Meanwhile, Daniel and his attacker rolled across the floor, knocking over chairs and scattering the careful arrangements that had made this place feel like home. Daniel was younger and faster, but the other man outweighed him by at least 50 pounds. "Where's that silver, Morrison?" Bearman demanded, stepping carefully around the fighting pair. "Make this easy on everyone and just tell us where you've been hiding your stash." "Go to hell," Daniel grunted, driving his elbow into his opponent's ribs. "Already been there," Bearman replied cheerfully. Wasn't much impressed. He raised his rifle, pointing it directly at Eliza. "Maybe your sister will be more reasonable." The threat to Eliza gave Daniel strength he didn't know he possessed. With a roar that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest, he threw off his attacker and lunged toward the fallen rifle. His fingers had just closed around the wooden stock when the third man, who'd been suspiciously quiet until now, spoke up from the doorway. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, friend." Everyone in the cabin froze. The third man was smaller than his companions, but something in his voice suggested he was far more dangerous. He held his rifle with the casual competence of someone who'd used it many times before. "Marcus Baxter sends his regards," the man continued conversationally. "Says to tell you he's gotten tired of playing games. Time to settle this matter like civilized folks." Baxter's idea of civilization involves burning down cabins and threatening innocent women, Daniel said, but he didn't reach for his rifle again. "Innocent?" Bearman laughed. "Girl tried to cave in Tommy's skull with a fireplace poker. Don't sound innocent to me." The man called Tommy was still holding his injured shoulder, glaring at Eliza with something that might have been admiration. "Fast little thing," he admitted grudgingly. "Hits harder than she looks." "Here's how this works," the small man said, his voice never losing its reasonable tone. "You're going to come with us to have a conversation with Mr. Baxter. Peaceful like, no trouble. And your sister is going to stay here and think real hard about whether she wants to see you again." "I'm not going anywhere without her," Daniel said flatly. "Course you are," the small man replied. "Because if you don't, we'll burn this cabin down with her inside it. And that would be a terrible shame. Such a pretty girl and all." Eliza felt the poker growing slick in her sweating palms. These men weren't just after the silver claim. They were using her as leverage to control Daniel. The realization made her feel helpless and furious at the same time. "Don't listen to them," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We can figure something else out." But Daniel was already setting down his rifle, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "No, we can't. Not if it means putting you in danger." He looked at her with eyes full of pain and regret. "I'm sorry, Lizzie. I'm so sorry I brought this trouble to your door." "You've got exactly 1 hour." The small man consulted a pocket watch with the casual air of someone discussing the weather. "Mr. Baxter's feeling generous today, so he's willing to hear your side of things before making his final decision about the claim." Daniel stood slowly, his hands raised to show he wasn't reaching for any weapons. "And if I don't come back in an hour? Then we'll assume the conversation didn't go well," Bearman said with a grin that showed too many missing teeth. "And we'll have ourselves a nice bonfire to warm up by." Eliza watched this exchange with growing horror. They were splitting her and Daniel up, taking away the only family she'd just found again. But underneath the fear, something else was building, a cold, calculating anger that felt strange and powerful. "Wait," she called out, as the men started herding Daniel toward the door. "What if I come with you instead? Leave Daniel here and take me to talk to this Baxter fellow." All 4 men turned to stare at her like she'd suddenly sprouted wings. Tommy, still nursing his injured shoulder, laughed outright. "Girls got more guts than brains," he said, not unkindly. "Women don't negotiate mining claims," the small man explained patiently. "Wouldn't be proper." "Maybe not," Eliza agreed, taking a step closer to the group. "But I might have something Mr. Baxter wants more than silver." Daniel's eyes went wide with alarm. "Lizzie, don't." "Information," she continued, ignoring her brother's warning, "about other claims in the area, about who's finding what, and where the real money is hiding." This was a complete lie, of course. Eliza knew nothing about mining claims or silver veins or any of the business that consumed the men of Cedar Falls. But she'd learned something important from watching Mrs. Caldwell deal with difficult boarders. Sometimes the best way to control a situation was to offer people something they thought they wanted. The small man's eyes narrowed with interest. "What kind of information?" "The kind that comes from cleaning cabins and listening to miners talk when they don't think anyone's paying attention," Eliza said smoothly. "Amazing what men will say around a girl they think is too simple to understand." It was Bearman who took the bait. "Tommy, you remember what Baxter said about the Henderson claim? How he thought there might be more to it than just copper?" "Henderson's the fellow who lived in this cabin before me," Daniel said, his voice carefully neutral. "Quiet man, kept to himself. Quiet men sometimes know the most interesting secrets." Eliza added, praying she sounded more confident than she felt, especially when they've been working these mountains longer than anyone else. The 3 men exchanged glances, some kind of silent communication passing between them. Finally, the small man nodded. "Bring them both. Baxter can decide who he wants to talk to." As they were marched outside at gunpoint, Eliza caught Daniel's eye and tried to communicate wordlessly that she had some kind of plan. The truth was, she had no plan at all, beyond keeping them together and buying time for something, anything, to change in their favor. The camp where they took her and Daniel sat in a clearing about half a mile from the cabin, hidden among the pines where smoke from cooking fires wouldn't be easily spotted. 3 more men waited there, along with horses and enough supplies for a group planning to stay in the wilderness for weeks. Marcus Baxter turned out to be younger than Eliza had expected, maybe 35, with the kind of careful grooming that suggested money and education. He sat on a folding camp chair like it was a throne, studying his prisoners with intelligent gray eyes. "Miss Morrison," he said politely, rising to tip his hat, "I apologize for the rough treatment. My associates sometimes lack finesse." "Your associates broke into my brother's home and threatened to burn it down," Eliza replied, matching his formal tone. "I wouldn't call that lacking finesse. I'd call it criminal." Baxter's smile was sharp as a blade. direct. I appreciate that in a woman. He gestured to a log that had been positioned like a bench. Please, sit. Let's discuss this situation like reasonable people. Daniel remained standing, his posture tense and ready for trouble. There's nothing to discuss. The claim is legally mine. I filed all the proper papers in Virginia City. Ah, but that's where things get interesting, Baxter said, pulling a folded document from his coat pocket. You see, I have a prior claim to that entire canyon, filed in 1865, before you ever set foot in Montana Territory. He handed the paper to Daniel, who scanned it with growing dismay. Eliza watched her brother's face go pale as he read the legal language that apparently gave Baxter rights to land Daniel had been working for months. This claim covers everything from Bear Creek to Willow Ridge, Daniel said slowly. That's thousands of acres. Indeed. I'm a man who thinks big. Baxter settled back in his chair. Now, I'm willing to be reasonable about this. You've done good work developing that silver vein, and I believe in rewarding enterprise. I'll buy your improvements for fair market value, and even offer you a job working your old claim for wages. Working for you, you mean? Daniel said bitterly. Working for the rightful owner of the land, yes. Baxter's tone remained pleasant, but steel showed underneath. The alternative is less appealing. Squatters can be removed by force if necessary, and any silver they've extracted can be claimed as stolen property. Eliza felt her heart sinking as she realized how neatly they'd been trapped. Baxter had the law on his side, along with more men and guns than Daniel could possibly fight. But as she watched the two men negotiate her brother's future, she noticed something odd. One of Baxter's men kept glancing toward the trees behind the camp, his hand resting on his gun like he was expecting trouble. When she followed his gaze, she caught a flash of movement among the pines, too deliberate to be wildlife, too careful to be accident. Someone else was watching this confrontation. Someone Baxter's men were worried about. She filed this information away and forced herself to focus on the conversation, looking for any advantage she could find. Daniel was losing this battle, but maybe it wasn't over yet. I have a counter-proposal, she said suddenly, surprising everyone, including herself. Baxter raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. My brother keeps half the silver he's already mined, plus a partnership stake in future operations. In return, I'll tell you everything I know about other valuable claims in the area. She paused, meeting Baxter's gaze directly, including the one that Henderson was working before he left town so suddenly. This was pure bluff, but something in Baxter's expression told her she'd hit close to a truth he cared about. The man was greedy, and greed made people take foolish risks. Henderson never filed any claims, Baxter said carefully. Filed claims and worked claims aren't always the same thing, Eliza replied, especially for men who prefer to keep their business private. In the silence that followed, she heard something that made her pulse quicken. The soft sound of someone moving through the forest, getting closer to their position. Their situation was about to change dramatically. She just hoped it would change in their favor. The first arrow whistled out of the pine trees and buried itself in the ground inches from Baxter's polished boots, followed immediately by a war cry that seemed to shake the very mountains. Everyone in the camp froze for one heartbeat before chaos erupted like a kicked hornet's nest. Indians! Bearman shouted, diving behind the nearest boulder as more arrows began raining down from the forest. We're under attack! But Eliza had caught something the others missed, a flash of familiar buckskin and the deliberate way the arrows were landing. These weren't random attacks meant to kill. They were warnings, carefully placed to scatter Baxter's men without actually hitting anyone. Daniel grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the cover of an overturned wagon. Stay low, he whispered, but his eyes were scanning the tree line with something that looked almost like recognition. You know who that is, she said. It wasn't a question. Before Daniel could answer, a figure emerged from the pines with the silent grace of a mountain cat. The man was tall and lean, with dark hair braided with feathers and skin weathered by years of outdoor living. But what caught Eliza's attention was his clothes. a mixture of Indian buckskin and white man's wool that suggested someone who moved between two worlds. Henderson, Daniel breathed, relief and worry mixing in his voice. You mean the quiet miner who used to live in your cabin? Eliza asked, pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicking into place. The one who left everything so neat and clean? Joseph Henderson, Daniel confirmed. Half Crow, half Scottish. Been working these mountains longer than anyone, and he knows where every vein of precious metal hides. He paused, studying the controlled chaos around them. Also happens to be the best tracker and hunter in 3 territories. Joseph moved through Baxter's scattered men like smoke, appearing and disappearing among the trees, while more arrows flew from hidden positions. Eliza realized he wasn't alone. At least 3 other men were providing covering fire from different directions, all of them working together with military precision. Morrison, Baxter called from behind his camp chair, which he'd overturned for protection. Call off your friend before someone gets hurt. He's not my friend, Daniel called back, though his tone suggested that wasn't entirely true. And I don't think he's planning to hurt anyone. Just make a point. The point became clear when Joseph appeared directly behind Tommy, moving so quietly the big man didn't notice until a knife touched his throat. Within seconds, 2 more of Baxter's men found themselves similarly captured, their weapons taken and their hands tied with swift efficiency. Mr. Baxter, Joseph said, his voice carrying the careful pronunciation of someone who'd learned English as a second language. We need to have a conversation about mining claims and the proper way to treat neighbors. Baxter straightened his coat with as much dignity as he could manage while crouching behind an overturned chair. This is highly irregular. I'm conducting legitimate business here. Pointing guns at women and threatening to burn down cabins is not legitimate business, Joseph replied calmly. It's the behavior of men who have forgotten how to live with honor. One of Joseph's companions, a younger man with the same dark hair and careful eyes, emerged from the trees leading a string of horses. Baxter's horses, Eliza realized. Every single one of their mounts had been quietly gathered while the confrontation played out. You're making a serious mistake, Baxter said, his composure beginning to crack. I have legal documents that prove my claim to this land. The territorial government will back me up. Legal documents written by white men in distant offices, Joseph said with a slight smile. But these mountains don't recognize paper claims. They recognize who treats them with respect and who tries to tear them apart for quick profit. He gestured toward the forest around them, where more figures were becoming visible now that they'd chosen to show themselves. Eliza counted at least 8 men, all armed and all watching Baxter's group with expressions that suggested they weren't impressed by legal paperwork. My people have been watching you, Mr. Baxter, Joseph continued, watching how you strip the land bare and poison the streams with your mining operations, watching how you treat the miners who work for you, paying them barely enough to survive while you grow rich from their labor. Business is business, Baxter said defensively. I run my operations according to territorial law. And we live according to older laws, Joseph replied. Laws that say a man who harms the land or threatens innocent people must face consequences. Daniel had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding. Now he stepped forward, still keeping Eliza close beside him. Joseph, what exactly are you proposing? Simple justice, Joseph said. Mr. Baxter and his men leave these mountains and don't return. They abandon their claims to Bear Creek Canyon and any other land they can't work with their own hands. In exchange, they get to ride away with their lives and their freedom. That's robbery, Baxter sputtered. You can't just void legal claims because you don't like how business is conducted. Can't we? Joseph's smile widened slightly. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and miles from any help. Your legal documents won't stop arrows or bullets. Your territorial government can't reach you here. He paused, letting the reality of the situation sink in. Sometimes mountains make their own laws. Eliza found herself studying the faces around her, realizing she was witnessing something far more complex than a simple conflict over mining claims. This was about different ways of life, different ideas about how people should treat the land and each other. Baxter represented the new way, organized, legal, efficient, but often cold and destructive. Joseph represented something older, more connected to the natural world, but perhaps harder for outsiders to understand. "Daniel," she said quietly, "what happens if we go with Joseph's plan? What happens to your silver claim?" "I don't know," Daniel admitted, "but I know Joseph's people have been here longer than any of us. If they're willing to stand up to Baxter, there might be a good reason." Baxter seemed to sense the mood shifting against him. "Miss Morrison," he said, addressing Eliza directly, "you seem like a reasonable woman. Surely you understand that civilization requires law and order. We can't have every dispute settled by whoever has the most arrows." Eliza looked around the clearing, at Joseph's calm confidence, at Daniel's worried but trusting expression, at Baxter's barely controlled desperation. Then she thought about the neat, peaceful cabin where she'd found the photograph that changed everything. A cabin where Joseph had lived quietly and respectfully before moving on to make room for her brother. "Mr. Baxter," she said finally, "I think civilization requires more than just law and order. It requires people treating each other with kindness and respect. From what I've seen today, Joseph's people understand that better than you do." The words seemed to hang in the mountain air like morning mist, beautiful and fragile but somehow permanent. Baxter's face went through several expressions before settling on resigned anger. "This isn't over," he said, but the fight had gone out of his voice. "Yes, it is," Joseph replied gently. "It's over, and everyone gets to walk away. That's more mercy than you showed when you came here with guns and threats." As Baxter's men were released and given back their horses, Eliza felt something shifting inside her chest. For the first time in years, she was watching people choose to do the right thing instead of the profitable thing. It felt like discovering that the world contained more goodness than she dared to hope. 6 months later, Eliza stood in the doorway of what had once been Daniel's cabin, but was now truly their home, watching the late afternoon sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. The photograph still sat on the mantel, but it was surrounded now by other pictures, images of their new life together, captured by a traveling photographer who'd passed through Cedar Falls in the spring. The sound of hammering drifted up from the valley below, where Daniel and Joseph worked together building a new kind of mining operation, not the strip-and-run approach that Baxter had favored, but something more careful and sustainable. They took only what they needed, shared the profits fairly with everyone who worked the claim, and made sure the stream stayed clean for the wildlife that depended on them. "Lizzie," Daniel's voice called from down the hill, "come see what we found." She picked up her skirts and hurried down the pine needle path that connected their cabin to the mining site. Over the past months, this walk had become as familiar as breathing. Down past the big boulder where wildflowers grew in summer, around the bend where you could see clear to the next valley, through the grove of aspens that whispered secrets in the wind. Daniel and Joseph stood beside the newest shaft, both of them grinning like boys who'd discovered buried treasure, which Eliza realized as she got closer they probably had. "Look at this," Daniel said, holding up a chunk of rock that seemed to catch the light and throw it back in silver flames. Joseph's grandfather told him there was something special about this spot, and the old man was right. "How special?" Eliza asked, though she could already guess from their expressions. "Special enough to set us up for life," Joseph said with quiet satisfaction. "Special enough to fund the school you've been talking about building. Special enough to make sure every family in Cedar Falls has what they need to get through the winter." The school had been Eliza's idea, born from watching the mining families struggle to give their children any kind of education. She'd started teaching a few of the youngest ones in the cabin, using books that Joseph had somehow acquired and her own memories of lessons from before her parents died. The children were hungry to learn, and their parents were grateful for any chance to give their families a better future. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, looking between the two men who'd become the foundation of her new life. That's a lot of money to spend on other people. What else would we spend it on? Daniel asked, genuinely puzzled. We've got everything we need right here. And looking around at the peaceful valley, at the clean streams and healthy forest, at the community of people who'd chosen cooperation over competition, Eliza realized he was absolutely right. They did have everything they needed. The sun was setting as the three of them walked back toward the cabin, their shadows stretching long across the valley floor. Eliza found herself thinking about the girl who'd arrived in Cedar Falls just 10 months ago, frightened, lonely, convinced she was invisible to the world and worthless to everyone in it. That girl wouldn't recognize the woman walking up this mountain path, surrounded by people who valued her opinions and trusted her judgment. The shy cleaning girl had discovered she had a voice worth hearing and ideas worth pursuing. More importantly, she'd learned that family wasn't just about blood relations. It was about choosing to care for each other through good times and bad. I've been thinking, she said as they reached the cabin porch, about names. Daniel raised an eyebrow. What about names? We've been calling ourselves Morrison all this time, because that's what we remembered from childhood. But what if we chose something new, something that represents who we are now instead of who we used to be? Joseph nodded thoughtfully. Many of my people take new names when they begin new chapters of their lives. It's a way of honoring growth and change. What did you have in mind? Daniel asked. Eliza looked around at the mountains that had become home, at the community they'd helped build, at the future stretching ahead of them full of possibilities. Something about this place, something about choosing to put down roots and build something lasting. Pine, Daniel suggested. Daniel and Eliza Pine. It's strong, it endures, and it's beautiful in all seasons. I like that, Joseph said with a smile. Pine trees bend in storms but don't break. They provide shelter for others and make the air cleaner just by existing. And so as the stars came out over Cedar Falls, Montana Territory, in the spring of 1868, Eliza Pine sat on her front porch with her brother and their friend, planning the school they would build and the community they would nurture. The photograph on the mantel inside showed where they'd come from, but their real masterpiece was the life they were creating together, one choice at a time. She thought about the cleaning girl who'd found a mysterious photograph and wondered what would have happened if she'd simply put it back and walked away. But that was the beautiful thing about life. Sometimes the wrong door turned out to be exactly the right one. Sometimes getting lost was the only way to find where you truly belonged. The mountains held their secrets close, but they'd shared enough to show three people that home wasn't a place you were born into. It was a place you chose to build, with people you chose to love, doing work that mattered more than money. And in the end, perhaps that was the greatest treasure any of them could have discovered.